The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across William's private study. He sat behind his mahogany desk, staring at the phone that had been ringing intermittently for the past hour. Palace staff moved quietly through the corridors, their voices hushed with the weight of recent news. Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, had passed away peacefully at Windsor Castle just 3 days earlier, and the royal family was drowning in grief and the overwhelming task of planning a farewell fit for a man who had served the crown for over 7 decades. William's fingers drummed against the polished wood as he contemplated the call he knew he had to make. It had been months since he and Harry had spoken properly, their relationship strained by years of misunderstandings, public revelations, and the painful distance that had grown between them since Harry's move to California. The brothers who had once been inseparable, united in their grief after their mother's death, now seemed like strangers living in different worlds. Catherine entered the study quietly, carrying a cup of tea that steamed gently in the morning air. Her face showed the exhaustion that had settled over the entire family since Philip's passing. She placed the cup beside William's elbow and rested her hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension that had knotted his muscles since dawn. "You know you have to call him," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who understood both the burden of duty and the pain of family division. "Grandfather would have wanted you both there together." William nodded, knowing she was right, but struggling with the complexity of emotions that churned inside him. Pride, hurt, love, and responsibility battled for dominance in his heart. He thought of Philip, who had always been the steady presence in their family, the man who had taught him about duty, service, and the importance of putting family before personal feelings. Across the Atlantic, in the sun-drenched hills of Montecito, Harry sat in his garden with Meghan, watching Archie chase butterflies across the carefully manicured lawn. The call from his father had come in the early hours of the morning, Charles's voice heavy with sorrow as he delivered the news that Harry had been dreading but somehow expecting. Philip's health had been declining, and Harry had wrestled with the decision of whether to visit England in recent weeks, knowing that such a trip would inevitably become a media spectacle and potentially cause more family stress. Now, as he watched his son's innocent joy in the California sunshine, Harry felt the full weight of distance. Not just the physical miles that separated him from his family, but the emotional chasm that seemed to grow wider with each passing month. He had been preparing himself for the difficult decision of whether to attend the funeral, knowing that his presence would bring both comfort and complication to an already challenging time. Meghan sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm as she watched the internal struggle play out across his features. She understood the complexity of his relationship with his family better than most, having experienced firsthand the pressures and expectations that came with royal life. She also knew how much Philip had meant to Harry, how the Duke's no-nonsense approach and military background had resonated with the young prince who had found his own path through service in the armed forces. "He loved you, you know," she said quietly, her voice carrying the warmth that had first drawn Harry to her. "He saw so much of himself in you, the military service, the dedication to duty, even the rebellious streak that drove him to modernize the monarchy in his own way." Harry smiled sadly, remembering the countless times Philip had offered gruff but genuine encouragement throughout his life. The Duke had been one of the few family members who had understood Harry's need to forge his own path, even if he hadn't always agreed with the methods. Philip's practical wisdom and dry humor had been a constant source of support during Harry's darkest moments, including the years following Diana's death, when Harry had struggled to find his place in the world. Back in London, William finally picked up the phone, his finger hovering over Harry's number in his contacts. The last time they had spoken had been tense and brief, a conversation that had left both brothers feeling frustrated and misunderstood. But this was different. This was about Philip, about family, about setting aside personal grievances in service of something larger than their individual hurt feelings. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before Harry's familiar voice answered, cautious but not unwelcoming. For a moment, both brothers were silent, the weight of months of separation and unspoken words hanging between them like a fog that neither knew how to navigate. "Harry," William said finally, his voice rougher than he had intended. "I'm glad you answered." "Of course I answered," Harry replied, and William could hear the slight tremor in his voice that indicated his brother was fighting the same emotional battle. "How are you holding up?" The simple question broke through some of William's defensive walls. He found himself describing the surreal quality of the past few days, the constant stream of officials and dignitaries, the media attention, the strange sensation of planning a funeral for someone who had seemed immortal. Harry listened without interruption, offering the understanding that only someone who had lived through similar experiences could provide. "I know we've had our differences," William continued, choosing his words carefully, "but Grandfather always believed in the importance of family unity, especially during difficult times. He would have wanted us to be together for this." Harry was quiet for a long moment, and William could almost see him sitting in his California garden, weighing duty against the complicated emotions that had driven him away from royal life in the first place. When Harry spoke again, his voice carried a resolve that reminded William of the brother he had grown up with, the one who had faced every challenge with courage and determination. "I'm coming home," Harry said simply. "Grandfather deserves better than our personal drama overshadowing his farewell." The relief that flooded through William was immediate and overwhelming. He had prepared himself for an argument, for Harry to cite security concerns or family tensions as reasons to stay away. Instead, his brother had chosen to honor Philip's memory by putting family first, just as the Duke himself had done throughout his remarkable life. They spoke for nearly an hour, carefully navigating around the subjects that had divided them while focusing on the task ahead. They discussed funeral arrangements, media management, and the complex logistics of ensuring that Philip received the send-off he deserved while managing the intense public interest that surrounded every royal event. As their conversation progressed, something shifted between them. The formal politeness that had characterized their recent interactions began to give way to glimpses of the easy familiarity that had once defined their relationship. They found themselves sharing memories of Philip, his legendary sense of humor, his passion for environmental conservation, his unwavering support for the Queen throughout their long marriage. William mentioned Philip's love of carriage driving, how the Duke had continued to compete well into his 90s with a skill and fearlessness that had worried and impressed his family in equal measure. Harry laughed, remembering how Philip had once convinced him to help with the horses during a particularly challenging course, resulting in both of them getting thoroughly muddy and earning a stern lecture from the Queen about proper behavior at public events. These shared memories began to rebuild the bridge that had seemed permanently damaged. Both brothers realized that their grief was opening a pathway back to each other, that their love for Philip was stronger than their personal disagreements. They began to discuss not just the funeral logistics, but their shared responsibility to honor their grandfather's legacy while also healing the wounds that had divided their family. Catherine, who had been quietly working at her desk nearby, noticed the change in William's voice as the conversation continued. The tension that had marked his features for months began to ease, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. She understood the significance of this moment, recognizing that Philip's death might paradoxically become the catalyst for healing that the family desperately needed. In Montecito, Meghan observed a similar transformation in Harry. The weight that he had carried since leaving England seemed to lighten slightly as he reconnected with his brother over their shared grief and determination to honor Philip appropriately. She knew how much Harry had missed his family, despite the complications that had driven them apart, and she saw in this conversation the possibility of reconciliation that went beyond mere duty. As their phone call drew to a close, both brothers felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from their interactions for too long. They were no longer just planning a funeral. They were beginning to rebuild their relationship on the foundation of shared love and respect for the man who had helped shape them both. William ended the call with a promise to send Harry detailed information about the funeral arrangements and security protocols, while Harry committed to arriving in London several days early to ensure that he could contribute meaningfully to the planning process. For the first time in months, both brothers felt like they were working toward a common goal rather than existing in separate worlds defined by hurt feelings and misunderstanding. The palace staff noticed the change in atmosphere immediately. Where there had been tension and careful avoidance of certain topics, there was now a sense of focused determination. William threw himself into the funeral planning with renewed energy, consulting with palace officials, military representatives, and religious leaders to ensure that every detail would reflect Philip's remarkable life and service. Meanwhile, Harry began the complex process of arranging his return to England, coordinating with security teams and palace officials while also managing the media attention that would inevitably surround his homecoming. He knew that his presence at the funeral would generate significant coverage, but he was determined not to let that overshadow the true purpose of his return. As the sun set over both London and California, the two brothers found themselves thinking about Philip and the lessons he had taught them about duty, service, and the importance of family bonds that transcend personal disagreements. They both understood that the coming days would be challenging, filled with intense emotions and public scrutiny, but they also felt a renewed sense of unity that had been missing from their lives for too long. The phone call that had begun with careful politeness had evolved into something deeper, a recognition that their shared grief was also a shared opportunity to honor not just Philip's memory, but the family bonds that had always been stronger than any temporary division. As they prepared for the difficult days ahead, both brothers carried with them the hope that Philip's final gift to them might be the reconciliation that their family and the monarchy itself desperately needed. The private jet descended through the gray London clouds, carrying Harry back to a homeland that felt both familiar and foreign after his months in California. He pressed his face to the small window, watching the patchwork of fields and suburbs give way to the sprawling metropolis that had once been the center of his world. His heart hammered against his ribs as familiar landmarks came into view. The Thames snaking through the city like a silver ribbon, the distinctive outline of Westminster, and somewhere in the distance, the towers and spires that marked the royal palaces where he had grown up. The weight of the moment settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. This was not just a return for a family funeral. It was his first time back in England since the explosive interviews and public revelations that had sent shockwaves through the monarchy. He knew that every move would be scrutinized, every gesture analyzed for signs of reconciliation or continued discord. But beneath the anxiety about public perception lay something deeper and more personal. The complex emotions of son and grandson returning to grieve with a family from whom he had become estranged. As the plane touched down at Heathrow, Harry could see the discreet security convoy waiting on the tarmac. The sight of the familiar black vehicles with their tinted windows brought back a flood of memories from his years as a working royal, when such arrangements had been routine rather than the carefully negotiated exception they had become. He gathered his belongings slowly, knowing that once he stepped off this plane, he would be stepping back into a world of protocols, expectations, and relationships that had become strained nearly to the breaking point. Meanwhile, at Windsor Castle, William stood in the room where Philip had spent his final days, surrounded by the personal effects that told the story of a remarkable life. The Duke's study remained exactly as he had left it, with naval charts spread across his desk, environmental reports stacked neatly beside his reading chair, and photographs of family celebrations spanning decades covering nearly every surface. The room still carried the faint scent of the Duke's cologne and the leather of his well-worn boots, making his absence feel both immediate and impossible. William picked up a framed photograph from the desk, a candid shot taken during a family gathering several years earlier, showing Philip teaching Archie how to hold a carriage whip while Harry and Meghan looked on with amused concern. The image captured a moment of pure family joy, untainted by the conflicts that would later drive Harry away. William studied his brother's face in the photograph, remembering how happy Harry had looked in those early days of marriage and fatherhood before the pressures and criticisms had become unbearable. The Queen entered the study quietly, moving with the measured steps of someone carrying enormous grief while maintaining the composure expected of a sovereign. At 95, she seemed smaller than William remembered, as if Philip's death had diminished not just her heart but her physical presence. She joined him beside the desk, her eyes taking in the familiar chaos of her husband's workspace with a mixture of love and loss that made William's throat tighten with emotion. He was working on conservation plans for the estate until the very end, she said softly, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had defined her 7-decade reign. Always thinking ahead, always planning for the future. He would have been pleased to know that Harry is coming home. William nodded, understanding the layers of meaning in his grandmother's words. Philip had always believed in the importance of family unity, but he had also been pragmatic about the challenges facing the modern monarchy. The Duke had lived through the abdication crisis, the changing role of the royal family in post-war Britain, and the evolution of public expectations about transparency and accountability. He had understood better than most that the monarchy's survival depended not just on tradition, but on its ability to adapt and heal its own divisions. At Frogmore Cottage, the Windsor estate property that had been Harry and Meghan's first married home, staff members worked quietly to prepare for Harry's stay. The house had stood empty since their departure, maintained but unused, a symbol of the life they had tried to build within the royal system before deciding that such a life was impossible. Now, as fresh linens were placed on beds and flowers were arranged in the sitting room, the cottage was being prepared to welcome Harry back for what everyone hoped would be a period of healing rather than further division. Harry's convoy arrived at Windsor as the afternoon light was beginning to fade, the familiar sight of the castle's ancient walls bringing back a rush of childhood memories. He had run through these courtyards as a boy, played hide and seek in the endless corridors, and sat through countless family dinners in the formal dining rooms. This was where he had learned about duty and service from Philip's example, where he had been comforted after his mother's death, and where he had first understood the weight of his royal responsibilities. The car stopped outside Frogmore Cottage, and Harry stepped out into the cool English air, breathing in the scents of grass and old stone that were so different from the California sunshine he had left behind. For a moment, he simply stood there, allowing himself to feel the complex emotions that came with being back in a place that held so many memories, both joyful and painful. William arrived at Frogmore an hour later, driving himself in a Range Rover rather than using an official car. He wanted this first meeting to feel as normal as possible, free from the formal protocols that had governed so many of their recent interactions. As he walked up the familiar path to the cottage, he thought about all the conversations he had rehearsed in his mind during the drive, the careful words he had chosen to navigate the delicate process of rebuilding their relationship. But when Harry opened the door, all of William's prepared speeches evaporated. Standing before him was not the distant figure for video calls or formal photographs, but his younger brother, looking tired and older but unmistakably familiar. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two men who shared not just blood, but the unique experience of growing up in the most scrutinized family in the world. "You look well," William said finally, and Harry smiled slightly at the understatement. They both knew that well was relative when dealing with the pressures they faced, but there was genuine relief in William's voice at seeing his brother in person. "The California sun helps," Harry replied, gesturing for William to come inside. "Though I've missed the English rain more than I expected." They settled in the sitting room that had once been a gathering place for happy family moments, but now felt like neutral territory where they could begin the careful work of rebuilding their relationship. William noticed that Harry seemed more relaxed than he had appeared in recent public appearances, as if being back on familiar ground had eased some of the tension that had marked his features during their video conversations. They began by discussing practical matters: the funeral timeline, the role Harry would play in the proceedings, the media arrangements that would allow for dignified coverage while protecting the family's privacy during their grief. But gradually, Their conversation shifted to more personal territory as they shared memories of Philip that had sustained them both during the difficult period of separation. Harry spoke about watching Philip's environmental documentaries with Archie, explaining to his young son about his great-grandfather's passionate commitment to conservation long before it became fashionable. William described Philip's final months, his frustration with declining health, but also his continued engagement with the causes he cared about, his insistence on reviewing estate management reports even when walking had become difficult. As they talked, both brothers began to recognize how much they had missed these conversations. Not just the sharing of family news, but the deeper connection that came from being understood by someone who had lived through similar experiences. Their childhood had been unique in its pressures and privileges, and despite their current differences, they remained the only two people who truly understood what it had been like to grow up as Diana's sons, under Philip's guidance in the glare of unprecedented public attention. Catherine arrived as evening fell, carrying dinner from the castle kitchens and bringing an ease to the conversation that had been missing during the brothers' careful negotiations. She had always served as a bridge between William and Harry, understanding both their personalities and the source of their conflicts. Her presence reminded both men of happier times when they had functioned as a close-knit team, supporting each other through personal challenges and public duties. Over dinner, they found themselves laughing for the first time in months as they shared stories of Philip's legendary gaffes and his ability to reduce even the most pompous officials to nervous silence with a well-timed observation. Harry recounted Philip's reaction to meeting some of Meghan's Hollywood friends, his bemused but polite attempts to understand their world, while making it clear that he found their concerns somewhat trivial compared to the serious business of public service. William described Philip's final carriage driving session, just weeks before his death, when the Duke had insisted on taking the reins despite his family's concerns about his safety. He said he'd rather die doing what he loved than waste away in a wheelchair, William recounted. The staff were terrified, but he managed the course perfectly and came back grinning like a schoolboy who'd gotten away with something. These stories began to weave a new narrative between the brothers. One focused not on their disagreements, but on their shared love for the man they were preparing to say goodbye to. They began to discuss not just the funeral arrangements, but their hopes for honoring Philip's legacy through their own work and their children's understanding of their heritage. As the evening progressed, Harry found himself describing life in California with more openness than he had shown in months. He spoke about Archie's fascination with nature, clearly inherited from his great-grandfather's influence, and about Meghan's work with various charitable organizations. William listened without judgment, recognizing that his brother had found genuine happiness and purpose even while pursuing a path that had caused pain for the rest of the family. In return, William shared the challenges of his increasing responsibilities as second in line to the throne, the pressure of preparing for a future role while still wanting to be present for his own young children. He spoke about George's growing awareness of his destiny and the careful balance required to give the children as normal a childhood as possible while preparing them for their future roles. Both brothers recognized that they were tentatively rebuilding something that had seemed irreparably broken. The foundation of shared experience and genuine affection had never disappeared completely, but it had been buried under layers of hurt feelings, public criticism, and the impossible pressures of their unique positions. Philip's death was forcing them to confront not just their grief, but the possibility that their relationship could survive and even grow stronger through this crisis. As Catherine prepared to leave, she hugged Harry goodbye with genuine warmth, telling him how much she had missed having him around and how happy she was to see him back home, even under such sad circumstances. William walked his wife to her car, and they spoke quietly about the progress they had observed during the evening. "He seems more settled than I expected," Catherine observed. "I think distance has given him some perspective on everything that happened. And I think I understand better now why he felt he had to leave," William replied. "I don't agree with all his choices, but I can see that he wasn't rejecting us personally. He was trying to protect his family the only way he knew how. When William returned to the cottage, he found Harry standing by the window, looking out at the castle walls where lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness. The sight reminded both of them of countless nights during their youth when they had looked out at these same walls, sometimes in excitement about upcoming adventures, sometimes in sadness after particularly difficult days, but always with the security of knowing they faced whatever came next together. "I know this is complicated," Harry said without turning around. "My being here, all the attention it's going to bring. I don't want to overshadow grandfather's farewell." William joined him at the window, both men looking out at the familiar landscape that had shaped their understanding of duty and family. "Grandfather would want you here," he said simply. "Whatever our differences, we're still his grandsons. We're still brothers." They stood together in comfortable silence for several minutes, both processing the significance of this moment of reconciliation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they worked together to finalize funeral preparations, and the coming days would test their renewed connection under intense public scrutiny. But tonight, for the first time in months, they were simply William and Harry again, two brothers preparing to say goodbye to the man who had helped raise them and who had believed until his final day that family bonds could overcome any obstacle. The conversation that followed lasted well past midnight, covering everything from their children's personalities to their hopes for the future of the monarchy. They didn't resolve all their differences. Some wounds would take much longer to heal, but they established a foundation of mutual respect and understanding that would sustain them through the difficult days ahead. As Harry finally prepared for bed in the cottage that had once represented his hopes for a different kind of royal life, he felt a sense of peace that had been missing since his departure from England. Tomorrow would bring the reality of public appearances and family dynamics, but tonight he was simply grateful to be home, preparing to honor the memory of a man who had taught them both that duty and love were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of a life well lived. The morning mist hung low over Windsor Castle as William and Harry walked together through the grounds where Philip had spent countless hours throughout his 99 years. They were heading to St. George's Chapel for their first formal meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury and military representatives to discuss the funeral service details. Their breath formed small clouds in the cool air as they moved along paths that Philip himself had traveled thousands of times, often at a pace that left younger family members struggling to keep up with his energetic stride. This was hallowed ground for both brothers, the place where Harry had married Meghan just 3 years earlier in a ceremony that had seemed to promise a new chapter of happiness and unity for the royal family. Now, as they prepared to use the same chapel for Philip's funeral, both men were acutely aware of how much had changed since that joyful spring day when the future had seemed full of possibility. The chapel's ancient stones seemed to whisper with centuries of royal history as they entered the space that would soon host one of the most watched funerals in modern history. Sunlight streamed through the magnificent stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the stone floor where Philip's coffin would soon rest. Both brothers paused for a moment, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment and the magnitude of what they were preparing to undertake. Archbishop Justin Welby greeted them with the quiet dignity that had made him a trusted spiritual advisor to the royal family during some of their most challenging moments. He had officiated at Harry's wedding, christened William and Catherine's children, and provided counsel during various family crises. Now he would help them create a service that honored Philip's remarkable life while providing comfort to a grieving family and nation. The military representatives were led by Colonel Sir Edward Smith Osborne, who had served under Philip in various capacities and understood the Duke's passionate commitment to the armed forces. Philip's military service had been one of the defining aspects of his identity, from his distinguished naval career during World War II to his decades of support for military charities and his role as Admiral of the Fleet. Any service honoring his memory would need to reflect this central part of his character. As they gathered around the altar where Philip would lie in state, William found himself remembering his grandfather's stories about naval service during the war. Philip had rarely spoken about the dangers he had faced, preferring to focus on the camaraderie and the technical challenges of naval warfare. But William had seen the medals and decorations that told a story of genuine heroism and dedicated service at a time when the fate of the free world hung in the balance. Harry, meanwhile, was thinking about his own military service and how Philip had been one of the few family members who truly understood his need to serve on the front lines in Afghanistan. The Duke had never questioned Harry's determination to deploy with his regiment, recognizing in his grandson the same sense of duty that had driven his own wartime service. Philip's support during Harry's military career had been unwavering, and the bond formed during those years had remained strong even after Harry's departure from royal duties. The Archbishop began outlining the structure of the service, explaining how they could incorporate Philip's love of music, his passion for environmental conservation, and his devotion to the Queen while maintaining the solemnity appropriate for such an occasion. The chapel had hosted many royal funerals over the centuries, but this one would be unique in its need to reflect Philip's distinctive personality while managing the complex logistics of a global media event during pandemic. The brothers found themselves working in remarkable harmony as they discussed various aspects of the service. William's attention to detail and understanding of royal protocol complemented Harry's instinctive grasp of how to make the ceremony meaningful for both the family and the broader public. They debated the selection of hymns, with Harry advocating for Eternal Father, Strong to Save, the naval hymn that had particular significance for Philip's maritime service, while William suggested including Guide Me, O Thou Great Redeemer, which had been sung at their parents' wedding and held deep family meaning. Colonel Smith Osborne described the military honors that would accompany the service, including the firing of minute guns from the east lawn of Windsor Castle, and the presence of representatives from all the military units with which Philip had been associated. The precision required for these ceremonial elements was enormous, involving hundreds of service members who would execute their duties with the flawless timing that the Duke himself had always demanded in military operations. As they discussed the procession route and the positioning of family members during the service, both brothers were struck by how naturally they fell back into their old pattern of collaboration. During their years as working royals together, they had developed an easy partnership that allowed them to divide responsibilities according to their strengths and preferences. William typically handled the more formal protocol elements, while Harry focused on the personal touches that made events memorable and meaningful. The conversation turned to the question of who would deliver the main eulogy, a decision that carried enormous symbolic weight. Both brothers understood that the words spoken in Philip's honor would be scrutinized not just for their tribute to the Duke, but for what they revealed about the current state of the royal family. They discussed various options, from having the Archbishop deliver a traditional religious homily to inviting someone from outside the family who had worked closely with Philip on his charitable endeavors. Harry suggested that perhaps they could find a way to incorporate multiple voices in the service, allowing different speakers to highlight different aspects of Philip's legacy. He proposed that someone could speak about the Duke's environmental work, another about his support for young people through the Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme, and yet another about his role in modernizing the monarchy during his early years of marriage to the Queen. William built on this idea, suggesting that they could include readings from some of Philip's own speeches and writings, allowing his own voice to be part of the service. The Duke had been a thoughtful and articulate speaker throughout his life, often ahead of his time in addressing issues like environmental conservation and the need for the monarchy to adapt to changing social expectations. Including his own words would provide authenticity while avoiding the political implications of having current family members make statements about contentious issues. As they worked through these details, both brothers became increasingly aware of the media attention that would surround every aspect of the funeral, particularly their own interactions. They knew that cameras would be looking for signs of reconciliation or continued tension, that body language experts would analyze their every gesture, and that their mother's legacy would inevitably be invoked in coverage of the event. This shared understanding led to a frank conversation about how to handle the public aspects of their reunion. Neither brother wanted their personal relationship to become the focus of what should be a celebration of Philip's life. But they also recognized that their demonstrated unity could send a positive message about the family's ability to overcome internal conflicts. They decided to make their collaboration visible, but not theatrical, working together naturally on funeral preparations while avoiding any gestures that might seem staged for media consumption. Their goal was to honor Philip's memory while also showing the public that the royal family remained united despite recent challenges. The Archbishop suggested that they might consider incorporating some of Philip's own innovations in royal ceremony, noting that the Duke had been instrumental in televising the Queen's coronation and had always understood the importance of allowing the public to feel connected to royal occasions. This perspective led to discussions about how to balance tradition with accessibility, ensuring that the funeral honored centuries of royal protocol while also feeling relevant to contemporary mourners. As the morning planning session extended into the afternoon, additional family members began arriving at Windsor to participate in the preparations. Charles arrived with Camilla, both looking exhausted by the emotional weight of the past week, but determined to ensure that the funeral reflected their deep love and respect for Philip, and drove herself to the castle, characteristic of her no-nonsense approach to both grief and duty, and immediately threw herself into the practical details of managing the logistics for the large extended family. Edward and Sophie arrived with their children, who would play important roles in the service as some of Philip's youngest grandchildren. The sight of these teenagers, who had grown up with Philip as a constant and loving presence in their lives, reminded everyone of the personal loss behind all the ceremonial planning. For them, this was not just a state occasion, but the farewell to a beloved grandfather who had attended their school plays, celebrated their achievements, and provided the kind of unconditional support that had defined his relationships with all his grandchildren. The Queen joined the planning session in the early afternoon, moving slowly but with determination as she took her place at the head of the table where decisions about her husband's funeral were being made. Her presence immediately elevated the seriousness of their discussions, as everyone understood that they were planning not just a public ceremony, but a personal farewell for a woman who had shared 73 years of marriage with the man they were honoring. She listened carefully as William and Harry presented the ideas they had developed during the morning's discussions, occasionally offering gentle corrections or suggestions based on her intimate knowledge of Philip's preferences and personality. Her input was invaluable in ensuring that the service would feel authentic to the man they all loved, rather than simply conforming to generic royal funeral traditions. One of the most moving moments came when the Queen produced a folder containing notes that Philip had made about his own funeral preferences over the years. The Duke had been characteristically practical about death, viewing funeral planning as just another form of event management that required proper preparation and attention to detail. His notes revealed a desire for a service that was meaningful but not overly sentimental, military in its precision, but personal in its content. Reading through Philip's own wishes for his funeral, both William and Harry were struck by his emphasis on celebrating a life well lived rather than dwelling on the sadness of loss. He had specifically requested that the focus be on gratitude for the opportunities he had been given to serve his country and his family, rather than on mourning what was ending. This perspective helped guide their planning as they worked to create a service that would honor his optimistic and forward-looking approach to life. As the afternoon progressed, the brothers found themselves working with an efficiency and mutual understanding that surprised even themselves. The months of separation and tension seemed to fade as they focused on their shared goal of creating a perfect farewell for the man who had helped shape them both. They divided tasks naturally, with William coordinating with palace officials on protocol issues, while Harry worked with military representatives on the ceremonial elements. The planning session concluded with a walk through the chapel to visualize how the various elements would come together on the day of the service. Standing in the space where they had shared so many family moments, from Christmas services to weddings to christenings, both brothers felt the full weight of what they were preparing to undertake. As they stood together near the altar where Philip's coffin would rest, Harry turned to William with a smile that carried both sadness and determination. He would have been proud of this, he said simply. Not just the ceremony, but seeing us working together again. William nodded, understanding that their collaboration on the funeral had become about more than just honoring Philip's memory. It was also about rediscovering their ability to function as a team, to support each other through difficult times, and to put family unity above personal grievances. The day's work had shown both brothers that their fundamental bond remained strong despite the challenges of recent years. They had different perspectives on many issues and had made different choices about their lives and careers, but their shared commitment to honoring their grandfather's legacy had provided a bridge back to each other. As evening fell over Windsor Castle, both brothers felt a sense of accomplishment and renewed hope. They had spent the day creating something beautiful and meaningful together, and in the process, they had begun to rebuild the trust and affection that had always been at the heart of their relationship. The funeral was still several days away, and there would be many more decisions to make and details to finalize. But the foundation had been laid for a service that would truly honor Philip's remarkable life, while also demonstrating the enduring strength of family bonds that even the most serious disagreements could not permanently break. The morning of Prince Philip's funeral dawned crisp and clear, with pale sunlight filtering through the ancient trees of Windsor Great Park. Inside the castle, the royal family prepared for what would be one of the most emotionally challenging and publicly scrutinized days of their lives. The weight of saying goodbye to Philip was complicated by the knowledge that the entire world would be watching, analyzing every gesture and interaction for signs of family unity or division. William stood before the mirror in his private quarters, adjusting his naval uniform with the same attention to detail that Philip had always demanded in matters of protocol and appearance. The Duke had insisted throughout his life that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing properly, and William was determined that every aspect of his final farewell would meet the exacting standards that his grandfather had set for public service. His hands trembled slightly as he fastened the ceremonial sword that had belonged to his great-grandfather, King George V. The weight of the weapon and the significance of the moment combined to create an almost overwhelming sense of historical continuity. He was not just preparing for a funeral. He was preparing to carry forward the legacy of service and duty that Philip had embodied for nearly 8 decades. Catherine entered quietly, already dressed in the elegant black coat and hat that she would wear to honor Philip's memory. Her presence immediately calmed William's nerves, as it had so many times throughout their marriage. She approached him and adjusted his collar with gentle precision, her touch conveying all the love and support that words could not adequately express in such a moment. "The children wanted me to tell you they're thinking about great-grandpapa today," she said softly, referring to George, Charlotte, and Louis, who would not attend the funeral due to their young ages, but who had been deeply affected by Philip's death. "George especially wanted you to know that he understands why today is so important." William smiled sadly, thinking of his eldest son's growing awareness of his royal destiny and the responsibilities that would one day be his. Philip had taken great joy in beginning George's education about royal duty, often taking him on walks around the estate while explaining the importance of service to others. The thought that George would grow up without his great-grandfather's guidance was one of the many losses that made this day so painful. Across the castle, Harry completed his own preparations with a mixture of sadness and nervous anticipation. Returning to Windsor for the funeral had been emotionally challenging, bringing back memories of both happy family moments and the difficult circumstances that had led to his departure from royal life. But working with William over the past few days had reminded him of the strength of their family bonds and the importance of honoring Philip's memory together. He wore the blues and royal's uniform that he had been so proud to earn during his military service, with the medals that represented his tours of duty in Afghanistan displayed prominently on his chest. Philip had been particularly proud of Harry's military service, understanding from his own experience the unique challenges faced by royal family members who wanted to serve their country in combat roles rather than merely ceremonial positions. As Harry prepared to leave his quarters, he paused to look at a photograph on the dressing table showing himself and William with Philip during a family shooting weekend several years earlier. The three men stood together in the countryside, their easy camaraderie captured in a moment of pure family happiness untainted by duty or public scrutiny. Harry touched the frame gently, making a silent promise to his grandfather that he would honor their shared values of service and family loyalty. The royal family gathered in the private apartments before making their way to St. George's Chapel for the service. The Queen, dressed in black with a diamond brooch that had been a wedding gift from Philip, stood with remarkable composure despite the enormous emotional burden she carried. At 95, she was saying goodbye to the partner who had been her constant companion and support throughout the longest reign in British history. Charles appeared older than his 72 years, the stress of recent family tensions and his father's death etched clearly on his features. But there was also a sense of resolution about him, as if Philip's passing had provided clarity about what truly mattered in life. He greeted Harry with genuine warmth, their embrace lasting long enough to convey forgiveness for past hurts and hope for future healing. And Edward and Sophie formed a protective circle around the Queen, their shared grief creating a unity that transcended any personal disagreements. Philip's children had inherited his practical approach to emotional challenges, channeling their sorrow into a determination to ensure that his funeral would be executed with the precision and dignity that he would have demanded. The procession to the chapel began with military precision that would have pleased Philip enormously. The carefully choreographed movements of the honor guard, the precise timing of the minute guns, and the flawless coordination of multiple elements demonstrated the kind of attention to detail that the Duke had always insisted upon in ceremonial occasions. William and Harry walked side by side behind their grandfather's coffin, their synchronized steps a visible symbol of their renewed unity. The physical act of walking together seemed to dissolve many of the barriers that had developed between them over the months of separation and disagreement. They were no longer the estranged brothers whose conflicts had dominated headlines. They were simply Philip's grandsons, united in grief and determination to honor his memory appropriately. The sight of the two brothers walking together sent a powerful message to both the royal family and the watching public. Their body language conveyed mutual respect and shared purpose, suggesting that Philip's death had indeed become a catalyst for healing the wounds that had threatened to permanently divide them. As they entered St. George's Chapel, both brothers were struck by the beauty and solemnity of the space that had been prepared for Philip's final service. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, creating pools of colored light on the ancient stone floor where centuries of royal ceremonies had taken place. The chapel felt both intimate and grand, perfectly suited for a service that needed to honor a man whose life had bridged the personal and the public, the traditional and the modern. The service itself was a masterpiece of careful planning and emotional authenticity. The music selections reflected Philip's love of both traditional naval hymns and contemporary compositions, while the readings highlighted his commitment to service, conservation, and family. The Archbishop's homily captured the essence of Philip's character, his dry humor, his passionate convictions, his unwavering devotion to duty, and his deep love for his family. One of the most moving moments came when a recording of Philip's own voice was played, sharing his thoughts on the importance of leaving the world better than you found it. His distinctive accent and characteristic directness brought him powerfully into the chapel, reminding everyone of his unique personality and the force of character that had shaped the modern monarchy. William delivered a reading from Ecclesiastes that Philip had specifically requested, his voice steady and clear as he honored his grandfather's final wishes. The passage spoke of times for every purpose under heaven: a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time of harvest, a time to weep and a time to laugh. The words seemed particularly appropriate for a man who had lived through nearly a century of dramatic change while maintaining consistent values and purposes. Harry's contribution came during the prayers of intercession, where he offered thanksgiving for Philip's example of service and his dedication to environmental conservation. His words highlighted the Duke's pioneering work on climate change and wildlife protection, causes that had become central to Harry's own charitable work in recent years. The connection between grandfather and grandson through shared environmental passion was clear and deeply moving. Throughout the service, the camera occasionally captured moments of interaction between William and Harry that demonstrated their renewed closeness. They shared him books naturally, offered each other quiet support during particularly emotional moments, and moved together with the unconscious coordination that came from years of shared experience in similar circumstances. The Queen sat with remarkable dignity throughout the service, her composure maintained through sheer force of will and a lifetime of training in public duty. But those closest to her could see the enormous effort required to maintain her composure while saying goodbye to the love of her life. The sight of her solitary figure in the chapel, separated from her family by pandemic restrictions, became one of the most poignant images of the day. As the service drew to its conclusion, the last post sounded across Windsor Castle, followed by 2 minutes of silence that felt both eternal and insufficient for honoring such a remarkable life. The silence was broken only by the sound of birds singing in the trees outside the chapel, a reminder of the natural world that Philip had fought so passionately to protect. The committal was conducted with a military precision that Philip would have appreciated, as his coffin was lowered into the royal vault beneath the chapel, while the royal family watched in respectful silence. The finality of the moment was overwhelming, marking the end of an era not just for the royal family, but for the nation that Philip had served with such distinction. Following the service, the royal family gathered for a private reception at Windsor Castle, with a formal atmosphere. The public ceremony gave way to more personal sharing of memories and emotions. It was here, away from cameras and public scrutiny, that the real work of family healing began to take place. William and Harry found themselves in conversation with their cousins, sharing stories about Philip that highlighted different aspects of his personality and his influence on their lives. Peter and Zara Phillips spoke about their grandfather's love of outdoor activities and his insistence that young people should test themselves against physical challenges. Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie shared memories of his dry humor and his ability to deflate pompous behavior with a perfectly timed observation. These conversations created a tapestry of memories that painted a complete picture of Philip as both a public figure and a beloved family member. The shared laughter and tears helped to heal wounds that extended far beyond the recent conflicts between William and Harry, bringing the entire extended family together in appreciation for the man who had been their anchor for so many decades. As the afternoon progressed, William and Harry found time for a private conversation that addressed not just their grief over Philip's death, but their hopes for rebuilding their relationship going forward. They acknowledged the hurts that had driven them apart, while also recognizing the fundamental love and respect that had never disappeared entirely. "I think Grandfather would be pleased that his funeral brought us back together," Harry said as they stood together on the terrace, overlooking the grounds where Philip had spent so many happy hours. He always believed that family was more important than any individual disagreement. William nodded, feeling a peace that had eluded him for months. "I missed having you to talk to about all of this," he admitted. "The responsibilities, the pressures, the constant scrutiny. You're the only person who really understands what it's like." Their conversation extended well into the evening, covering everything from their children's futures to their own evolving roles within the royal family. They didn't resolve every issue that had divided them, but they established a foundation of mutual understanding and respect that would allow them to rebuild their relationship gradually and authentically. As the day drew to a close, both brothers felt that they had succeeded in their primary goal of honoring Philip's memory with a service that captured both his public achievements and his personal character. But they had also accomplished something equally important. They had rediscovered their ability to function as brothers, united by shared values and common purpose despite their different paths in life. The funeral had indeed become more than a farewell to Philip. It had become a renewal of family bonds that had seemed permanently damaged just days earlier. Philip's final gift to his family was the catalyst for healing that allowed them to move forward together, stronger and more united than they had been in years. Walking back to their respective quarters as the sun set over Windsor Castle, both William and Harry carried with them not just grief for what they had lost, but hope for what they might rebuild together. Philip's legacy would live on not just in the institutions he had served and the causes he had championed, but in the renewed strength of the family bonds that his death had helped to restore. The world had witnessed a funeral that honored a remarkable life of service and duty. But for the royal family, it had been something even more precious, a day when love proved stronger than division, when shared grief became the foundation for renewed hope, and when Philip's greatest lesson about the importance of family unity was finally fully understood by those who loved him most.